Hello. So today we are continuing our discussion about the Great Depression and about how the Great Depression impacted Americans. And so what you've hopefully got started on for your assignment, the impacts of the Great Depression. And in that assignment, you have 5 sets of photographs that you are going to be analyzing and then trying to corroborate with the text source. So in other words, you're trying to match up in a reading that I provided for you information that supports what you see in the photographs about the Great Depression. So the first couple ones that you looked at represents social impacts of the Great Depression. Social means how people live and how people interact with one another. So I want you to think about what are some of the social impacts that you've seen so far in the Great Depression. And you might think, well, I know that people lost their jobs and that people were evicted from their homes. And that means that they didn't have homes to go to, that they might have been traveling around, migrating around with their family in search of work. Perhaps they didn't have food to eat. Perhaps they didn't have the proper clothing to give to themselves or their children. And so those are really the social impacts of the Great Depression, how it impacted how people live. So the next thing I want to talk about today is something else that happens during the Great Depression. So the Great Depression happens during the entire 30s. We really aren't out of it until World War II starts in 1941. Well, when the U.S. joins World War II in 1941. And the Great Depression is during that whole 10-year period. And something else starts to happen that makes it even worse. So honestly, I think you guys can relate. Think about 2020 and think about how it wasn't just one thing that was a challenge. It was lots of things that were challenging. And so that's the same thing with the Great Depression, although for them it was over the span of 10 years instead of one. So hopefully ours is just, can stay in 2020. But regardless, we're also going to talk about something that happened called the Dust Bowl. So the Dust Bowl was a time of severe drought and dust storms in the American Midwest. And you can see right here, this is the American Midwest, the middle of the country, that happened during the 1930s. And this happens by a combination of both human and environmental reasons. So one of the things that happens is that there is a drought, so no rain. There are high winds, more winds than normal, which is, again, nature. But there are humans involved in this too. And one of the things that had happened was in the Midwest, people had farmed. This is the heartland, the breadbasket of the United States. This is where most of the crops are being grown. And people thought that you could just kind of, till up the earth as much as you want and there'd be no consequence. And unfortunately, what happened was they tilled up so much of the earth that they eroded the topsoil. On the topsoil and all the natural grasses, kind of like the grasses if you ever go to like the beaches around here, kind of on the edge when you're walking up to the actual beach, there's kind of like those grasses. Sometimes they have prickers in them, but they are there to kind of hold the sand back, and it's a natural barrier that holds the sand down a little bit. It's the same kind of thing that happens in the Midwest when all of those natural grasses were torn up to make the farms. It loosened the soil, and the soil had nothing to grab a hold of. And so when the drought happened, which was a nature thing, there was no rain, so it made everything more dry. And then on top of that, you also have a lot of wind. So the combination of the drought, the high wind, nothing to hold down the soil, creates these massive dust storms. They kind of look like blizzards, and in fact, they were called black blizzards because of the way that it was a storm that approached, blanketed everything with dust, and it wreaked havoc on the Midwest for 10 years. So what I'd like for you to do is, even if you're just watching the video, I'd like you to pause here, and I'd like for you to go into this week's folder, and I'd like for you to watch the Dust Bowl Ed puzzle. It's about 12 minutes, and I love it because it has a lot of primary source evidence, pictures, movies, well, not movies, but video, and even people who were little during the Dust Bowl talking about their experiences. So go ahead and watch that and then come back to the video. Okay, so hopefully you've watched the video now. And one of the things that I want you to think about are what are some words that come to mind when you think about the Dust Bowl after you watch the video. You might think storm, you might think dramatic, you might think dirty, you might think terrible, you might think famine. All of those things are good words, and you might think other words too, but I really wanted you to think about how this impacted the people. And remember, this is happening at the same time as the Great Depression. So there's already a lot of problems, and a lot of these people have already encountered issues, and now this just kind of adds on to it. So, like we mentioned, the Dust Bowl happened for a couple of different reasons. It happens because we were over farming the Midwest, and that had to do with the overproduction of agriculture during World War I. We have gas-powered equipment, which is going to be able to till the soil more efficiently, and they're tilling more of the soil more efficiently. Then we have grasses being taken away. We have the nature part of the drought and the high winds, and it just lifts that topsoil up and causes it to be dirt, which they call dust, but dirt, dust, whatever. You can see here, and this is just dramatic. This is what it looked like of the winds taking the dirt off of the fields. And then, of course, over here is what people experienced. So during the Dust Bowl, farmers were not able to grow their crops because the only thing that was left behind was not the nutrient-rich topsoil that they needed. It was just worthless parts of the dirt. Plus, the wind knocked up everything, blew nothing, it didn't rain. And then you also heard about the static electricity in the video that sometimes would kill the plants as well. So all of those things made it very difficult for crops to grow. On top of that, for the human and really animals too, people were breathing this in. We've talked about this before. Every time you breathe something into your lungs, it stays there. Your lung is a sponge. There is no exit for anything except for carbon dioxide, sorry. So this is causing havoc, and it's sickened thousands of people. It killed thousands of people because they got dust pneumonia. They got dust in their lungs. And you also saw in the video about how it killed livestock and other native animals. It was devastating. So what happened? Well, some people toughed it out, but a lot of people left. A lot of people were pushed out of the Midwest, and they were pulled to California in search of work, and you can see that on the map here. They were called Okies once they got to California because California just kind of lumped all of them as people from Oklahoma, even though that wasn't the case, but Oklahoma was hit the hardest. And so they called them Okies, and just like we talked about before in our last class, these people packed up their families, they moved to California, hoping to find work on California farms. Sometimes they did. Sometimes they didn't. But this was all, again, everything was made worse because we were also in the middle of the Great Depression. So we will talk about how the Dust Bowl eventually ends. But just like with the Great Depression, it's a combination of things. It's not just one thing that makes it end. And it wasn't just one thing that made it start. But we're going to see it's a combination of human and nature kind of working together to get to the end of the Dust Bowl. So for your assignment, if you have not watched the Dust Bowl Edpuzzle yet, then you need to watch that. Secondly, you need to complete the impacts of the Great Depression, which does have a section on the Dust Bowl on it, and that is due at our next class. And I went over the instructions for that in our last class, and if you didn't catch that, you can look at the video for the last class as well. All right, next time we'll talk about how the Great Depression finally ends, and then we'll be wrapping up Unit 3. Let me know if you have any questions.